The pounding of rain against the roof echoed through the house, competing with the booming rolls of thunder. A kaleidoscope of light, like frozen lightning, cast eerie shadows across the room. I was alone, 16 years old, and my first time in this quiet, almost painfully suburban house without my parents. I hated thunderstorms, but tonight, the thrumming rain felt like a comforting blanket, muffling the rest of the world from me. Or so I thought. An hour into the storm, nestled in the comforting crevices of a worn-out couch, engrossed in an old novel, I heard it, a scraping sound, like nails dragging across the wooden siding of the house. I froze, listening. Maybe it was just a tree branch in the wind, I told myself. The wind and the storm could play odd tricks on your ears. But then it came again, a gnashing, grinding noise, louder this time, followed by a muffled thump, as though something or someone had thrown their weight against the door. A primal, icy fear crawled up my spine, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, matching the rhythm of the storm outside. Taking a deep breath, I tiptoed to the front window and peered through the slit in the blinds. It was almost impossible to make out anything in the rain-drenched darkness, save for an occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the yard in stark white light. The next peal of thunder shook the house and me with it. My breath hitched as my eyes caught a shadow, something formless and dark, huddled by the door. There was someone there, scrabbling at the doorknob, pushing against the door in rhythmic thuds. My heart pounded with a mix of terror and adrenaline. I was alone, without any immediate help. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, but just as I unlocked it, the lights flickered and went out. The storm had claimed the electricity. My fear escalated, the darkness of the house swallowing me up. The only illumination was the sporadic, ghostly glow from the storm outside. Emotions churned within me, fear, horror, and a rising paranoia. Each sound was magnified, the crack of thunder, the creaking of the house, the splatter of rain against the window, and overall, the relentless, sickening scrapes and thuds at the door. The intruder was persistent. Gulping back tears, I dialed 911. A dispassionate voice answered, promising help would come. But with the storm, it could take time. Time I wasn't sure I had. After what felt like hours, the assault on the door stopped. An eerie silence filled the house, only broken by the distant murmur of the storm. I didn't dare to breathe. I felt hunted, watched, an uneasiness pricking at my senses. Then a guttural growl echoed from the back of the house. The intruder had moved to the back door. Suddenly, the front door burst open, the wind and rain howling through the entryway. I screamed, running towards the back of the house, away from the open door. But I skidded to a stop as the back door, too, creaked open, revealing nothing but the stormy night beyond. I was trapped. Tears streamed down my face, blending with the cold sweat beating on my forehead. Suddenly, two beams of light flooded through the front door. I heard the blare of a siren, and my knees buckled in relief. The police were here. I raced towards the front door, the rain whipping my face as I staggered outside. A figure stepped out of the police car, but it was not an officer. It was my neighbor, Mr. Harris, a sheepish look on his face. "I'm sorry, kid," he stammered. "I had one too many drinks, thought this was my house." In the quaint little town of Eldridge, Nebraska, nestled amidst the rustling cornfields, there exists a bizarre annual tradition. On the eve of each year's harvest, when the moon hangs low and orange in the sky, the town congregates in the town hall, holding a vigil until dawn. They call it the Night of the Harvest Watch. Outsiders consider it quaint, even charming, but the people of Eldridge know better. It's not tradition, it's survival. The tradition started after a string of odd occurrences and sudden disappearances in the town many decades ago. Elders speak of the Shadow Eater, a spectral entity from a time before the town existed. A creature drawn to the darkness within the human heart, feeding off fear, despair, and loneliness. It was said to come with the harvest moon, an eerie omen that blanketed Eldridge with dread. Our protagonist, John McKenna, a disillusioned journalist from New York, arrived in Eldridge, drawn by the allure of the mysterious tradition. He hoped to reignite his stagnant career, believing that the fears of Eldridge would make an enticing story. That evening, As the townsfolk huddled together in the town hall, John chose to observe from afar. He stationed himself in a small inn that overlooked the hall. As midnight drew near, he felt a shift in the air. It became dense, almost tangible, carrying an undercurrent of fear that made his hair stand on end. The townsfolk's fear wasn't baseless superstition. It was palpable, bone-deep, and real. Suddenly, a cry echoed from the town hall. John rushed to his window, his heart pounding. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, had enveloped the building. It seemed alive, shifting, and contorting. Panic-stricken cries filled the night as the Shadow Eater made its presence known. Barely thinking, John grabbed his camera and ran towards the hall. This was the story of his career. As he approached, the air grew colder, the fear thicker. Suddenly, the front doors burst open, and out stumbled a man, his face twisted in terror. The darkness pursued him, wrapping tendrils around him, pulling him back towards the hall. Then John felt it, a coldness creeping into his heart, a bleakness that threatened to consume him. His deepest fears began to surface, their intensity magnified tenfold. The fear of failure, of dying alone and unloved. It was the Shadow Eater, reaching into him, finding the darkness within his heart. Driven by a sudden realization, John lifted his camera and snapped a picture. The flash cut through the darkness like a knife. The shadow shrieked, recoiling from the sudden light. It released its victim and retreated, disappearing back into the night from whence it came. The vigil ended. The townsfolk stepped out, looking shaken but relieved. John understood then. The vigil wasn't an act of fear, it was defiance. A stand against the darkness that threatened to consume them. The Shadow Eater, he realized, fed not only off fear, but off loneliness and isolation as well. The unity of the townsfolk was their defense, their shared fear, their shield. The Harvest Watch wasn't about avoiding the shadow, but confronting it. The story John wrote was different than he intended. It wasn't about a town living in fear, but a town standing united against it. His article earned him widespread acclaim and reignited his career, but he chose to stay in Eldridge. The experience had changed him, teaching him the power of unity and the strength that came from confronting his fears. Every year, when the harvest moon shone in the sky, John would stand with the townsfolk, no longer an observer but a participant. The Shadow Eater still came, but now it faced a town unwilling to be consumed by their fears. It was at the edge of twilight on an ordinary Tuesday evening that Sarah Collins found herself standing at the foreboding entrance of the long-abandoned Holworth factory. A sturdy woman of 35, Sarah had made a living out of salvaging rare parts from forgotten machines. An order had come in for components found only within the machinery at Holworth, coaxing her into the rusting skeleton of the industrial district. The factory, an industrial leviathan of brick and steel, was an eerie sight. It stood as a ghostly monument to a bygone era, casting long shadows that devoured the faint evening light. Its skeletal remains, under the pale wash of twilight, bore an uncanny resemblance to a desolate haunted house from an old horror movie. With a resolute deep breath, Sarah pushed the creaking factory door and stepped into the gloom. The air inside was heavy and stagnant, tainted with the musty smell of decay and wet rust. The deeply quiet within was only broken by the distant drip of leaking water and the soft scuttle of rats. Her flashlight carved a narrow path through the inky blackness, the narrow beam casting grotesque shadows on the machinery that lay silent and forgotten. As she ventured deeper into the heart of the factory, she discovered an old office, a decaying time capsule in the sea of darkness. Amidst dusty papers and antiquated equipment, a rusted safe sat stubbornly in the corner. It seemed oddly out of place, a silent sentinel holding on to secrets of a time long forgotten. Intrigued, Sarah made a mental note to return with tools from her shop to explore the safe's contents. Just as she was about to leave, the sound of coarse, hushed voices echoed from below. She followed the sound and found herself peering through a cracked floorboard. Below, in the factory's underbelly, a ruthless gang of criminals was plotting. Their faces, scarred by violence and hardship, were lit by the dim glow of a solitary lamp. Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine as she overheard their conversation. They were orchestrating a series of high-stakes robberies across the city, planning to use the factory as a base. The very thought sent a wave of dread washing over her. She realized that she was trapped in a spider web of criminal conspiracy in the bowels of an industrial mausoleum. She needed to escape and alert the authorities, but the factory was a labyrinthine nightmare of corroding machinery and shadowed corners. With each step, the creaking metal and the groaning floors seemed poised to betray her presence. As she navigated through the factory, every rustle and scrape was a specter of imminent danger. In her desperate flight, she stumbled upon an old maintenance phone, miraculously functional despite the decades of neglect. With trembling hands, she dialed 911, her voice barely above a whisper as she relayed the gang's chilling plot. As she hung up, her heart hammered in her chest. She heard the distant echo of footsteps growing louder. They were coming. Sarah bolted, her heart pounding in her ears like a frenzied drumbeat. She could hear the criminals closing in, their shouts echoing in the desolate expanse of the factory. Each thunderous footfall felt like a hunting drum, growing louder and more terrifying with every passing second. She dashed towards the main entrance, her adrenaline-fueled run turning into a desperate sprint. Just as she felt her strength give out, the factory was suddenly flooded with the harsh blare of sirens and the stark flash of red and blue lights. Police swarmed the factory, their sudden arrival disrupting the grim chase. Sarah was quickly taken to safety as the gang was apprehended. Her terrifying ordeal had not only prevented a citywide crime spree, but also unmasked the criminal underbelly lurking within the city's industrial ghost. However, despite emerging as an unsung hero, the terrifying events of that night left a permanent scar. The once forgotten Holworth factory had become a symbol of hidden terrors, a grim reminder of the darkness that could fester within the decaying bones of the city's past.